Well, welcome from FameLab Academy. Welcome to the second teacher training workshop hosted by FameLab Academy and Dr. Heather Bray of the University of Western Australia. My name is Wayne and I'm the project manager for FameLab and FameLab Academy in Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging our partners, sponsors and supporters that have made FameLab Academy 2022 possible. Firstly, our partner Cheltenham Festivals, the creator of FameLab Academy. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our generous sponsors who have made this exciting program possible this year. And those are the Fogarty Foundation, the McCusker Charitable Foundation, and the WA Museum. FameLab Academy is also supported by the Western Australian Government through the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation. I'd also like to especially express my gratitude to Dr. Heather Bray from UWA for her enthusiasm, her time, efforts, expertise that she has so generously donated to formulate these teacher training workshops and for sharing her knowledge with us today. To all the teachers who are in attendance, thank you very much for your time and for joining us. And for the teachers who aren't able to make it, we know we're all under the pump this year at schools. The live workshop will be recorded and I will share that link around so that everyone can enjoy the benefits. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Heather Bray, who will commence with Welcome to Country and then get into Teacher Training Workshop number 2. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Wayne. I'll just share my screen and move the people window over there. I'm going to just have a chat window over there so that I can see what people say. Slideshow from the beginning. So yes, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for the second teacher training workshop. My name is Heather Bray, as Wayne mentioned. There is my email address should you like to follow up. I've also put this slide right at the very end so you can see my email address again there if you wanted to get in touch with me about anything that I covered today. And I've also got my Twitter handle there. I tend to be a bit quiet on Twitter these days, but I do occasionally check it out. So if you wanted to follow me there, please feel free. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are standing today. I'm on Whadjuk Noongar Budja, so I would like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people and their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge that Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people are and were science communicators. They are Australia's first science communicators who use storytelling as a way to explain and pass on knowledge from generation to generation. And this is a tradition that many science communicators are trying to emulate today. So the goals for the teacher training workshops broadly, what Wayne and I have discussed is to really help provide you teachers with knowledge and tools to support your students' participation in FameLab Academy. And so in the last workshop and in this workshop, I am making sure that I include traditional public speaking basics and ideas that will help in science presentations that you can take away and introduce to your students or work with your students straight away. But I'm also trying to raise awareness of science communication as an important field of practice and inquiry within STEM. Most people probably are aware of science communicators as people who are either scientists or know about science and who may be on television, for example. Sir David Attenborough is often the first science communicator that people think of, or Brian Cox more recently in astrophysics. But science communicators work in a range of diverse fields throughout STEM. We're in museums, we're in research centres, we're producing written work, we're producing digital content more and more. There is a whole range of emerging opportunities for people with science communication skills in STEM, and so that's another reason why I became involved in these workshops. And if you weren't here last week, just a quick recap about myself. My original training was in agricultural science. I did my PhD in animal production science. and worked as a research scientist both in Australia and in the Netherlands for a few years. I ended up then leaving science as an early career researcher, which unfortunately many people do, but I then moved into science communication, and I started off at the Adelaide version of SciTech, the Investigator Science Centre, working, developing programs, delivering school outreach. Then I ended up being an education officer for a research centre developing genetically modified crops, and then transitioned into doing research into people's attitudes to genetically modified crops or biotechnology in food more generally. And I continue to do research in attitudes to both the use of animals and also biotechnology in agriculture, as well as now actually teaching the next generation of scientists. So I've sort of been a practitioner and a researcher, and now a teacher, and still remain a scholar within science communication. And it's been my career really the whole time, either talking about science or doing science in some way. So in this workshop, we're focusing on a couple of things. As I mentioned, there's something for you to take away straight away, but also I'm hoping to broaden your understanding of science communication as a field of inquiry. And so we're going to start off with looking at strategic communication and how we can apply strategic communication principles to science communication. And I guess we're building on the idea that we left with last week, where we decided that science communicators or science communication was more than just being a good public speaker and knowing stuff about science. There's actually something else to science communication that's above and beyond just being able to talk to people about science. Then I want to look at actually structuring a presentation. Last week we covered gestures and we covered nerves, but actually thinking about how to structure a presentation is going to be something that ideally you'll be working with your students to do. I'm going to briefly touch on visual aids and props. Wayne will remind me whether students are allowed PowerPoint slides in FameLab Academy at some point, but I believe they are allowed props. I've spent more time, I have more content on visual aids, unfortunately, than props, but I can definitely cover a little bit on props as well. And then I want to almost end I want to think a little bit about reflecting and reflexivity and how we can encourage our students to appraise their own practice and feel comfortable appraising their own practice and thinking about oral presentation in the same way we do with anything else, and that it just takes practice to get good at it. And then I just want to briefly touch on some science communication careers and education opportunities. So, as I mentioned, I want to start with a little bit of strategic communication, and we'll discuss why I think this is still important to FameLab Academy after I do this fairly short little piece here. But I think strategic communication is a very, very important aspect of science communication, but it's the aspect of science communication that I think scientists feel least comfortable about. I think most scientists would believe that they are communicating their science for the good of humankind, to share their science with the world. And so when we start talking about using strategy or thinking strategically about the communication, I think they think it sounds a little bit like marketing, and they think, oh, no, I don't do that. I'm not into marketing. I'm just telling the truth. However, I think you still really need to be cognizant when you're communicating, thinking about who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, and what you're trying to say. And to me, an acknowledgement of these three things is really what underpins a science communicator, because you need to be able to pivot anytime you're talking to a different type of person and for a different type of reason. And so I usually abbreviate this as PAM, purpose, audience, message. I've actually got it here as audience, purpose, message. But to me, these things are like a Gordian knot. You can't talk about one of them without the other two. Who you're talking to is going to depend on what you're trying to achieve, and what you say is also going to depend on that too. So these are the three things that are like a Gordian knot that in science communication, and then everything else flows from that. So let's look at purpose. Why communicate? So one of the or there's a range of reasons why we might communicate science. And as I said, we'll talk about the specific example of FameLab Academy shortly. But in the broader sense, usually we're trying to do one of these 5 things. Usually it's create awareness. But we also might be trying to influence attitudes. We might be trying to deepen understanding or educate as well. We might be trying to motivate action or change behaviour. Or, and this is emerging in some areas of science, we might be trying to build trust or credibility, or even repair trust if it's been broken over a certain issue. So when you think about awareness, this is usually telling people something that they don't know. So an awareness campaign would really ideally help people just know about a thing, know that it exists. They might have a bit of information about what that is, but to me, that's an information campaign apart from an awareness campaign. So the sorts of questions that we might ask is like, have you heard of this? Well, there's this thing. And then later on you can say, have you heard of this? And more people eventually say, yes, I've heard of it. But obviously, if we're going to be talking about education or understanding, this is different to awareness. This is where we want people to be able to understand something sufficiently to talk to a friend about it or to pass that knowledge on. Something about that it's become embedded in their knowledge frameworks and ideally worldview and how they think about the world. Your teachers, you know exactly about the difference between education and then, say, awareness raising or information gathering. But this is a subtle difference that sometimes scientists don't necessarily understand. They think that if they do an awareness campaign, people will change behaviour. But these are different things. Changing behaviour is different again to just education and may require very different tactics. I'm talking about adults, and we're talking about them engaging with the material for a short period of time. I realise that the education system is exactly supposed to be changing behaviour, and I wouldn't be a teacher myself if I didn't think education actually had some good outcomes. But if we're trying to change behaviour in a public context, then we do need to have really persuasive tactics, and we need to be able to understand what it is that makes people change behaviour. And unfortunately, it's not knowledge, and often it's not even attitudes. And then, of course, we may even be trying to change communities and societies. And this is where we're trying to change social norms. And ideally, we might even be wanting something to be regulated. Activists are very good at this and getting community support. And this, again, is a very different thing. And perhaps this is one of the issues we've had with climate change communication, is that we haven't been able to penetrate the new social norms area. People know what they can do or should do, but maybe feel unable to do it. So there's these different layers in science communication. And so I think being really critical about the outcome that you're hoping to achieve, and usually it won't be one, it might be many, but there's an exercise that you could do with your students, not necessarily for FameLab Academy, but to present students with a problem and then say what approach that should be, what audiences should you work with, and what message you could have. And you could have these range of purposes and discuss the differences. Sometimes in science communication, we are just trying to entertain, or we might be wanting to have a dialogue. So there's a range of goals that you need to, that science communication can have. Picking which one depends on your purpose and your message, of course. So who are your audiences? I teach my students in science communication that there is no such thing as the general public. There are publics. We take on different personas and move through different communities ourselves. We change. There are many communities. So the idea of a general public as a homogenous mass is really a myth. And if you aim at the general public, you'll probably not actually hit anyone. It's like kicking a goal without any goalposts. So thinking about audiences, I usually say to my students, think about stakeholders, but you can also think of other terms to describe the kind of people who should know about your research, or who actually care about your science, or who care about your message, and who actually has the capacity to do something about it. There's no point trying to actually, speaking to the wrong audience if they don't have the capacity to do the change or to process the information that you're trying to pass across. And so again, these relate to your purpose. I mainly wanted to keep this in because of that incredible visual pun there of my stakeholders. But I think there's also levels of communication, and thinking critically again about, are we trying to communicate at the level of an individual or a network or an organization or whole communities, and how might we do that? The tactics that we choose, and again, scientists don't like that word because it suggests something sinister, but the tactics that we use in science communication are going to depend on all of those sorts of things. And so often with my science students, I might be saying, who are you communicating with? They may be looking at funders, they may be looking at different communities, but they also might be talking to future employers or future collaborators. So these are some of the examples that I use when I'm talking to my students. And maybe, again, when you're thinking about working with your students, you could have an exercise where there's different audiences and different community members. So if we're talking to grey nomads, that might be very different to talking to Gen Z about something like plastic pollution. And then what will you say? Now, by this, I don't mean the specific content, but I mean in terms of your key message. And unfortunately, in science communication, we know that facts are not enough. So we know that if you provide information and assume that public opinion and behaviour will change, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And we know this very well in science communication, because arguably it's some of the failures of science communication through the noughties. The reason why we don't have the nice things now is, I think, because we were relying on this idea that information alone would change behaviour. One of the things we first need to think about is framing. So framing happens in the media. You'll see one story represented in one way by the ABC and in a completely different way by Channel 7. And that's because those organisations are framing the story to their audience. The example I use with my students is that you might have a very different version of what happened at the party on Saturday night for your friends than for your parents. You might give the same information, but you tell the story in a different way. And I love this particular video, this little image of Dolly Parton that came out, because that's exactly the kind of thing that most of our students, certainly my university students, already have an innate sense of. They already, when they use social media, they know how to tailor the message for different audiences. And social media and different social media platforms are a classic way where we curate different personas of ourselves for the different audiences. And so we tailor ourselves to the audience. So we know the media does this, and it is important to make sure that when we frame, we obviously use framing for good and not for evil, but that we make sure that we're using language that actually resonates with our audience. One of the other strategies that I think is really important to continue to teach is, of course, very, very old ideas around rhetoric, and in particular, the 3 persuasive appeals. So this, of course, goes back to ancient Greece, but I think it's quite amazing how we see this sort of triangle of logos, ethos, pathos playing out in different storylines. So that's for people who like both types, fantasy and science fiction there. But when we look at persuasive appeals, the first one is ethos, where we're talking about the moral character of the speaker. It's an appeal to ethics. So when we're trying to persuade someone, we might use devices that talk about, how we are good people, we share values. It also is around credibility claims like, I know what I'm talking about. I'm Dr. Heather Bray. Look at my 20 years of experience in science communication. So arguably, I used that device early on in this presentation because I'm hoping that I'll be able to persuade you through this presentation to do certain things. And I've used my credibility as a way to try to persuade you. So we often see scientists do this, and it happens in science communication. Of course, it only works if your audience actually values that credibility or that kind of expertise. And this is one of the things that we're actually seeing more generally in science communication and in society. Logos, and of course, this is another one that features very strongly in science communication, is the use of logic to persuade people. And here's the evidence. This is what science says. But again, logos really only works if you're talking to an audience that also values that logic and rationality and doesn't actually value other things greater. And of course, this is where we also know that logical fallacies can appear like logic. And unless we have an audience who's able to discriminate between logical fallacies and actual evidence, people can frame messages in a scientific way that are not scientific at all. And I don't think I even have to explain what that one's about, because we've just been living through it for the last couple of years. But that particular website, Correlation Not Causation, there's some fascinating little graphs on there. There's one about Nick Cage movies and I can't remember other things, but I just love that they can actually get the lines to match. You know, we can make any data correlate really, but correlation is not causation. And of course, the one that scientists are possibly the most reluctant to use, and the one that we need to be really careful about, is Pathos. I say we have to be careful about it because every time I even give this workshop, seeing that picture of the bear, it really gets to me. But unfortunately, and this is what happens sometimes when we use emotion, it's too much. I feel overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. And so we have to be really careful with the use of pathos, because if we want the audience to identify with us and we want them to feel an emotional connection with what we're saying, but we don't want to take away their agency. We don't want to make them feel like there's nothing that they can do. And so it's a fine line between triggering an emotional response and making the audience feel overwhelmed and powerless. And I think it's really important to remember the theory of planned behaviour. This is something that's been around in marketing world or in strategic communication world for a very long time. But often when I show scientists or people with a science background, they've never seen it. As I said, it's been around since 1985. But this is a fairly robust model that stands up and has been used in a whole range of sort of psychological, sociological, marketing kinds of studies. And what it shows is that the only thing that has a direct line to whether someone changes behaviour is whether they intend to do it. But the thing that also is directly associated with it is perceived behavioural control. Can they do the thing? So the things that really influence behaviour are, first of all, the attitude is important for intention, but also the subjective norm. Do they think everyone else is doing it? Is that what society does? Is that what we do in our society? So that's important. But then whether I think I can actually do the behaviour is important. So if we're trying to tell someone you should go to the gym, we don't have to educate them on why they should go to the gym. We don't even necessarily have to change their attitude, even because they may intend to, or we don't need to tell them that everybody else, you'll really like it, or everyone else is going to the gym. What we need to do is let them know that it's easy to do that, or make it easy to do it. This is one of the issues with recycling, and even when we start to get to climate change, it's like, how easy are the things for me to do that I need to do? And this is where sometimes we might need to be changing regulation or things like that to actually make sure that it is easy for people to do the things that they are meant to do. And so I encourage my students and my fellow scientists to almost create a little bit of a table, because often even in one presentation, there might be more than one audience. But if they're doing a research project, I recommend that they try to come up with a range of strategies or a range of audiences, purposes, and messages, so that they can start to make sure that wherever they are, they're hitting the nail on the head, and that they've got all of these different frames ready to go when they're talking to different audiences. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to just touch on why I thought this might be important to FameLab Academy. And I actually, with questions without notice, I might just stop sharing here and just throw back to Wayne for a moment. So Wayne, when the students are preparing for FameLab Academy, have they been told who their audience is, and are there any limitations on the purpose? Are they trying to educate, inform, entertain? What kinds of things are they doing in FameLab Academy?
FameLab Academy is judged on the 3 C's. So it's content, clarity, and charisma. So we do encourage a broad range of topics. It shouldn't be part of the curriculum. So it really sort of encourages them to look to their interests, what particularly fascinates them. And then according to our judging, those are the 3 criteria that they are judged on. And I think your the slides you've just shown on having a clear purpose and building a structure and building a strategy is such an important part, because ultimately you're taking, you know, a vast amount of research, a vast amount of information, and you've got 3 minutes to deliver it. You can't just, you know, throw out the information. There's either 3 C's are contained in the judging sheet that I sent, and how to score them. It's content, clarity, and charisma. And I think in some ways that touches on the PAM acronym, is that what is your content? What are you trying to do? How can you distill that and have get your message across with clarity? And then finally, as a speaker, is your own charisma, your charm, your as we say in the booklet, is do you wish that the speaker would carry on for longer? You know, and if you can pull those off, you're doing pretty well. And our rules are also, as you mentioned earlier, Heather, is no slides.
Yeah.
So you can use props. So again, it allows you to bring in charisma, not just as a demonstration to get your point across, but actually be pretty charming with the props you use and make it, you know, quite entertaining. So I think, you know, that idea of starting out with a structure, who you're speaking to, what you're trying to achieve, is very, very important.
Yeah, and so I do think it would be important for the students to really reflect on whether they want to entertain, inform, persuade, and you know, engage, so that they can start to think, okay, well, if I want to be engaging and entertaining, what kinds of things might I want to be doing? How am I going to do that to the panel? What might they be interested in? How can I use language to make sure that I'm doing those things? If I'm wanting to persuade, how might I want to motivate the audience to give up plastic? What might I do? You know, or that sort of stuff. How might I do that? So I still think encouraging the students to think critically about their purpose will really help them start to think and distill, to start to be able to make judgments about what to include and what not to include, you know, to not tell the whole story of whatever it is, but to get the 3 minutes that are going to be crisp, that are going to be sharp, they're going to be on point, and that are going to really resonate with the panel.
Another point you touched on, Heather, was just knowing your audience. Sometimes if you do, you know, scientific research, there's a lot of jargon that comes out, and, you know, sometimes throwing those words around seems to demonstrate your knowledge, but it's just going way above your audience. So understanding their level of understanding and talking to them in those terms that they do understand. And my background is marketing. And it's funny how many years we used demographics as identifying people. So, you know, women aged 25 to 35, that is just not a homogenous group of people. And, you know, the sooner we can get away from that and actually start understanding the psychographics and understanding their backgrounds and their interests and etc., ultimately the better communicators we're going to be.
Absolutely. All right. Were there any other questions around those that little bit of communication strategy in science, a little bit of Pam. If we're all good?
All good.
Okay, I shall move on. I shall share screen again. Yes. So I'm now going to move on to looking at structure, and where I've used the word content there because I also lecture on video production and podcast production. Even though this is a talk, it all applies. But in terms of giving you a resource that you may find useful in your teaching in other areas, if you're doing video production or you're encouraging students to do other things, it's the same kind of principle. So I think within science communication, there tends to be two main structures. And I'm not talking about a scientific presentation until where, it's the aim, methods, results, conclusion. But I think there's sort of two main ways to approach a story or a presentation, either in a news type structure or a narrative type structure. So I would say that for an audience that's not a specific science one, they're my two go-tos. So when we look at narrative, of course, traditionally has the 3-act structure. Most people say that a narrative is something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That doesn't necessarily tell us what those things are. But in science, we may be talking about a context or a rationale, like a problem statement. What is the thing that is happening? Then there's the more dense information in terms of, there's detail and whether that's methods or results or analysis, or just more detail about how something works, why it works. And then ultimately at the end, we still have our conclusion and future plans. So we still, even when we are doing the typical science structure, we're doing sort of an introduction, it builds. I would argue that we still have the conflict that you tend to have in most narrative structures. You've got the resolution. Most people would tell you that a PhD is very much like Lord of the Rings, where you slave away and then very much at the end, you sort of throw the thesis into the fire and hopefully you get rewarded. So we do see these sorts of narrative arcs and the idea of sometimes you might set them up as a good versus evil, or a journey, a there and back again kind of journey in science, or a journey of discovery. And I think it's fairly easy to build these kind of narrative structures in science. You can also think of it as a 5-act structure, which is, again, similar to what I was saying, where you've got the exposition, rising action, a climax, falling action, and denouement. Sorry, I don't speak French at all. But, there's that resolution at the end. And so I think the students should be aiming to hook people in and then build the action and then make sure it concludes, so that thinking about the structure of their presentation. And so in science, why are you doing this? How are you doing it? What did you find? What does this mean? What happens now? That kind of also fits that 5-act structure, or that narrative arc. But everyone loves a story, but again, consider your audience. Now, as I mentioned, I'm drawing on material that I also use when I talk about video production. And I personally am a big fan of feature articles and storytelling. But if you are really, really trying to capture someone, they may not have the attention span to wait for the climax, unfortunately. And so you might want to hit them harder earlier. And so instead of using this storytelling technique, it may be something where you want to hit them more like the news. So again, it just depends on the context and the audience. But a news structure is often referred to as an inverted pyramid, because you have the most important information at the beginning and then you have more detail. So if people start to tune out, they've actually got the most information. So, excuse me. To me, the most important still information is actually still a triangle that way up. I have a complete problem with this upside down pyramid as being, oh, the most important information is an upside down pyramid, because to me, the pointy stuff is at the top and you start with the most important thing and you actually get broader and broader and broader. But that's just me having difficulty with the shape of this. So excuse me. It's got a tickle in my throat there. But you can see that in some ways this is actually giving the answer away at the end. And it may not be appropriate to do that in this particular context of FameLab Academy, but I wanted to include it because there may be situations where you really have to make an impact early. And I think reflecting on a news type structure is a way to do that. And so in science, it means that if we're trying to do it like in a news structure, it means that we're telling scientists to write upside down from the way they normally would, because normally they will tell you the conclusion at the very end. And to say, no, you've got to tell me what you found. In fact, it should even be in the headline. It should even be in the title, don't have any suspense there. Give the game away straight away. They don't feel very comfortable. But if you were to do a news type structure, you would start with the conclusion and then provide the context. So start with the punchline and then explain more and more. So it, as I said, it may not suit this particular context, but I think it's interesting to introduce this type of structure to students. They often, and particularly for science students, they don't tend to consume much news, young people. And they don't read newspapers necessarily, and so they don't even see this as a structure. They find it quite difficult to get that you would have the conclusion, have the big findings at the end, up the front. So it's interesting to see how students relate to these story structures based on what they're consuming. So when I'm talking to my students about trying to write this way, I do have to tell them to write it backwards. You start with your conclusion. What's the big bang idea? And then what was it that you were trying to show? What makes sense to people so that they can understand it? Focus only on the results that support the conclusion, not everything else. And then the methods, so that you end with the bit that, particularly if those methods are interesting or quirky, but you start with the big hitters up the top. A couple of other principles relating to how story structure. One is the idea of chunking. You noticed even in this presentation, I've broken it up into sections. This is a chunk, we stop, chunk. And if you're trying to listen to a presentation that has no slides, you really want to make it clear to the audience how those chunks fit together. Particularly if you're coming up with more than one idea, but I would also recommend that in 3 minutes you should have one core idea. But if you're needing to introduce things, make it really clear how that comes in. So you have to give the equivalent to white space or the equivalent to line breaks within the presentation. Help the listener return. You might have to say, now remember at the beginning I was looking at this and then we went here, now I'm going here. When I've had to give presentations with no visual aids, you almost have to tell them where they are in the table of contents so that they know where they're going. And that scaffolding and chunking of the message is really important. Similarly, and again, I know that we're not talking about slides, but just a similar idea is when we look at written information. I talk about layout and written information and text panels in terms of streakers, strollers, and studiers. There's the people who only want to streak past, and you need to give them information at the top level. Then there's the strollers. They will only read the next level, and the studiers will read every word. I definitely come from a family of studiers. We go to the museum for hours in my family, and every text panel is read in detail and often aloud too. So that I've become a streaker. I'm one of these people who's like, right, no, I want to just zoom past. But even in our speeches, even in our presentations, trying to make sure that we actually have these ideas embedded in there, that we can have a hierarchy of information, and we bring that hierarchy, and then when we turn to the next topic, we come back up again to a higher level concept and build down. So that when we structure our presentation, often, you might have sort of 3 sections. I don't know, everything's in 3s, but you introduce each idea with almost a topic heading, a topic sentence, to remind the listener, oh, this is a new idea, and I'm going to get more detail about this next. And oh, here's another new idea, and I'm about to get more detail. So I think structure is really important in presentations. The other thing that we want to do is use story techniques, no matter which storytelling techniques, no matter which structure we have. We need to have lots of metaphors, lots of really visual language, lots of similes, lots of analogies. We want to make those words come alive and help people draw those pictures in their heads, particularly if we're talking about something that is invisible, that cannot be seen, that is remote from people's experiences. So really rich metaphors are important, but we do have to be careful because metaphors can be very, very powerful. When we have this idea of our immune system like an army, then we talk about battling diseases, and then we end up talking about people who've lost the battle, which isn't necessarily, I think, a very helpful way to think about disease processes, and it can be quite harmful for people. So we just have to be really careful about the kinds of metaphors that we use. Lastly, you can still set up a presentation like a storyboard in a movie, and particularly if you're working with props, to say, right, this at this section, then it's this kind of prop that I want to use. It's this kind of image that I want to have. But so I would still recommend that your students either script or storyboard to some extent, even though there's no PowerPoint slides. So they can have a time, they can have the script, and they could have, maybe prop or visual, or other instructions like picks up glass of water, for example, if they're going to be using a glass of water as a prop, and so that they know how the words are going to go with their actions. So I would definitely recommend a storyboard type approach to helping them structure their presentation. Now, I was planning an activity, but I am already running a little bit over time, and I think given there's only a very small number of people actually physically here, I'll skip that. But I will just find out whether people wanted to ask any questions about structure or feedback. Any questions around storyboarding, structure, anything? Did you want to make any comments, Wayne? Yeah.
Fantastic for me. Very well illustrated. So, yeah.
I think a storyboard would be really a useful way to help the students start, and particularly to start matching, to start getting the time, to start getting the chunking, to start helping them think about when they're going to make it a transition from one idea to another, and also, yeah, those props and integrating that. They may start off with just writing it out, but then getting them to break it up and chunk it up into a storyboard, I think, would be a good idea.
It's I really believe in the structure of it. Just consuming on YouTube a bunch of content creators, they do talk about it, and they, when you watch a 5-minute video, it looks so effortless and it looks so easy, and behind the scenes they're always talking about how they scripted it, how they planned every single cut, and really the planning that you put in makes it look effortless at the end and makes it sound effortless at the end, as opposed to, get up and speak and you've got a couple of notes and you want to get from A to B and do it in 3 minutes. The being very, very deliberate about your structure will always pay dividends.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, within the lesson plan, had a 5-minute break, but I think I might continue. I just had a little sip of water then. So if everyone else is happy to just continue, and then that way, if we end up finishing a little earlier, then, we can have a bit more of a discussion. Is everyone okay with me just forging on rather than taking a short break? I do just I do find that sometimes sitting and looking at a screen is pretty bad. It can be annoying. Sorry, Daisy, y'all happy to continue?
Sorry, did it not come through? Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I think I spoke over you, sorry. So yeah, let's keep going then. Right. So I didn't actually share them. I was just seeing where I was up to. Whoops. Share screen. Now, I was also going to try and get the chat bubble over. Yes, beautiful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about visual aids and props. The visual aids include PowerPoint, which, as I mentioned, may not be particularly relevant to FameLab Academy, but I'm sure it's something that I hope it's something that you might use more generally with your students. I will say right now that several of the things I'm saying about PowerPoint, I break in this presentation, but that's because I'm talking to a particular audience and have a particular purpose. And if I was to just be an after dinner speaker, I would probably have no text. But here, obviously, I'm in an educational setting. We all put text on the slides. We know that students take the slides away as a record. I think if I ended up giving lectures with no text on them, my students would start screaming. So yes, I realise that I am breaking some of the rules in this presentation. But I think it's interesting, the idea about whether PowerPoint has destroyed the tradition of public speaking. And also, I think it has probably radically changed teaching, at least teaching at university. And I think we've seen the traditional 4 dot points and a text and a little image. But obviously, PowerPoint has a range of purposes within an educational setting. It's also a good prompt for the speaker often and replaces a palm card. And it is part of that structuring for listeners. So without it, that's again why it's important to think really critically about structure and how you're going to take your listener through that 3-minute journey and make sure that they can process all the information in order. Even when you are using PowerPoint, it's not a substitute for you and is really an illustration. And it really should be a case that the PowerPoint still has some limitations, even if you're not there. Again, that's where the students get unhappy and they want all the information on it. But ideally, it's just a visual aid. PowerPoint is best when used to illustrate a presentation rather than as a set of talking notes, which the presenter then reads aloud. This is partly because it's difficult for people to read and listen at the same time. We can't help but read the text when it's there. It's also pretty boring, but there are good reasons why we fall into this trap. Bullet points help us to remember what we need to say, the slides become a record, and it's the conventional norm for giving presentations and slides. PowerPoint is used best when it's used to illustrate a story. And I can't remember what was on the other slides now, but I used to be able to do this and repeat exactly the same slide, damn it. But it's used best when it's used to illustrate a story. It's not particularly interesting when people read text out of loud. It's not very engaging, but of course it has become the norm in teaching practice, and we know that it becomes a useful thing for students. Now, ideally, people should have realised that this section here, we're just using the illustrations, is more engaging than the bit that I did before, but my mind went blank and I couldn't remember the words. I apologise. However, this particular image, I just wanted to show you this. This is quite a beautiful thing. It's a traditional storytelling technique from Japan where it's a sort of set up theatre, and on the back of these illustrations there's a little bit of notes for the storyteller, but it's a way to tell stories to groups of people, and effectively it's like a really old PowerPoint where the illustrations are there. There's an interesting technique that you may want to try with your students one day called pecha-kacha, which is also a Japanese word. And in that situation, it's very much based on this kind of storytelling technique where you usually have a fixed number of slides and a fixed time. So it's almost like 20 slides in 20 minutes or something like that. And you actually have 1 slide per minute and no text. So it's a very interesting sort of presentation style. Obviously, pictures do help if you're using PowerPoint, and they can convey a lot more information. These days, we have to use animations fairly sparingly. I try to avoid them because it's not the 90s anymore. And of course, we have to still consider that sometimes the aspect ratio is different. So when you're preparing slides, make sure you know which way around they're going to be. And try to avoid spelling mistakes. I usually find them in the middle of my lectures, not when I'm preparing them, but it is really important to proofread them if you're using them. Now, props. This is obviously the part that is more relevant, and I only have 1 slide on this. However, I think it's really important to think about the category of prop. We have our literal props, and in TED Talks, you'll see when someone talks about the brain and they bring out a human brain. So I'm not suggesting that your students are likely to do that, but they may have literal props, like imagine a glass of water, there's the glass of water. But there might be metaphorical ones where something actually it relates to another object. Imagine this glass of water is actually the sea, those kinds of things. And then I've suggested that there's this third category called representative. And I don't mean in that situation, I mean, it's in a slightly different way to the metaphorical way, where I'm really talking about this as almost a diagram or an illustration. So, you know, when I've used a presentation where we had large models of DNA that we'd made out of pool noodles. So we are still representing the thing that we have there, but obviously that's not either a literal model nor is it a metaphor. And I think the key thing to working with props is rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Now I've got a presentation here, a TED Talk by a man named Hans Rosling. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but he was an epidemiologist and he gave several TED Talks in the noughties. But this is one of the best use of props that I think I've ever seen. So I just want to play a very, very short part of it.
And the developing world, she said, and the 2 billion educated, rich, and they had small families. And their aspiration was to buy a car. And in 1960, all Swedes were saving to try to buy a Volvo like this. This was the economic level at which Sweden was. And most people tend to be somewhere in the middle. This is the new world we have today in 2010. And what will happen in the future? Well, I'm going to project into 2050. I was in Shanghai recently, and I listened to what's happening in China, and it's pretty sure that they will catch up, just as Japan did.
So I just wanted to stop that there. You can see in the image what Professor Rosling has done here. He's using the IKEA boxes to effectively build a bar graph, because he's talking about the relative population of people. And so he's saying most people are here. Each of these boxes represent a certain number of people, millions of people. And he's also trying to draw a comparison between what we think of as the first world, they're the people flying planes, and then the middle class who are driving cars, and then we get to the next class down, they've got bikes, and then the bottom, the poorest of the poor have got shoes. And so he moves these boxes to show that the relative distributions of what we think of as the poorest and the richest are actually quite different, and challenging our assumptions about that. And I think the use of the boxes in a representative way to represent you know, the number of people or things like that, the use of the models in a metaphorical way to sort of represent each of the different classes is such a clever way to introduce quite a challenging concept. And I definitely encourage you to have a look at his TED Talks. As I said, the bottom line is rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. If you're actually wanting something to happen in your props, I have done plenty of science shows in my time. And, you know, does the rocket bottle actually launch today? Who can tell? So you have some, and I've also worked with animals, and animals don't tend to do things on cue. So if your student is wanting to demonstrate a phenomenon, then obviously they're going to have to make sure that they've done that many, many times, and that it's ideally a predictable phenomenon as well. Now, we can talk a bit more about props. There's also audience interaction, and that this is actually a great way to engage. There's a few different types. One could just be passive, which are either rhetorical questions, using humour, asking people to imagine. And so making sure that your students include that kind of thing to involve the audience in their presentation, I think will be really important. Secondly, questioning. Hands up who's done this before, you know, where you can test existing knowledge, test learning, stimulate interest, compare expectations, so that, you know, they're the kinds of things that you can use, that hands up who has done this. And it's a very easy way to get your audience feel like they're part of your presentation. Stuff in your seat, actions, visual games and tricks, quizzes, depending on your setup, but there might be a way for your students to start off with, who thinks this? Who thinks this? Okay, let's see who's right. So ways to actually encourage the audience to participate, I think are easy ways to make your presentation more engaging. And here's just a very a simple one, example, but obviously it's a PowerPoint example. But in this particular kind of audience participation, you're trying to get the audience to say the, now I think we have to say the colour, not the word. So we have to say green, yellow, red. No, I've already done that wrong. Green, red, pink, purple, blue. And because our brain wants to say the word rather than the colour ones. But that's another sort of thing where you can ask people to read something out or do a little test to see how easy or difficult things are depending on the topic of your talk. Now, I wanted to head towards or have a bit of a discussion now around how we can help our students reflect and assess their own performance. So I'll stop sharing, and I know that there's not very many people here to be able to discuss, but I think this is one of the most challenging things that I have as a presenter myself in a range of contexts, but also as a teacher of presentations. We encourage our students to rehearse and they present on the day, and then we give them feedback. But there's data that suggests that their memories of how they did are probably not particularly accurate. And we know that a lot of students have anxiety about presenting. And so one of the things that I also encourage my students to do is to watch videos of themselves. And they go, oh, no, I hate listening to the sound of my voice. Oh, I don't want to look at myself. And yet on social media, our younger generation are looking at themselves all the time, but unfortunately they're not necessarily looking at accurate versions of themselves because of filters and things. So these are the kinds of things that I wanted to throw around. Like, how are we going to be able to encourage our students to watch themselves on video, because it's one of the best ways to improve, or listen to themselves on radio, and be able to self-reflect in the same way we are encouraging them to read their own writing and do preliminary editors and recognize errors and recognize areas for improvement in their own work. How can we do that in an oral presentation context, and how might some of the issues facing this new generation make this quite challenging. I'd love to hear some thoughts, whether this is an issue you've even considered. Is it something that you think is an issue? I'd love to hear from you.
I think one thing you just touched on, Heather, is, and you're so right, is we are used to editing ourselves in writing. You can read it and you can cross out a sentence and you can insert, or you can highlight a piece, or you can, you know, if you're writing on a laptop or a computer, you can, you know, cut and paste it somewhere else. And we have that skill down. And yet with public speaking, to hear your voice or to see yourself is still quite novel and quite confronting. Fortunately, everyone has a video camera in their pocket nowadays, so we have the means to do it, but I guess it would be just making it, and I'm not sure how, but making it as natural as editing our writing, to watch ourselves back and go, actually, I should say this earlier, or say this in a different way, or we certainly have the means.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I'm making, is that when we're teaching students to write, we tell them that they will make drafts and they're not going to do it perfectly the first time, and that there's drafts and they need to revise and revisit. We also say to students, rehearse your presentation, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. But if they're watching themselves in the mirror, that's a bit difficult. So they can't then reflect on that in the same way as you can with a written piece of writing. So it needs to be a bit more than just rehearsing in the mirror. I think there needs to be a way for them to actually review their own performance. But if we have students that are reluctant to watch themselves, or who are going to be ultra critical of themselves, then this is a difficult thing for them to do, particularly I think in this age where so many, for example, on Instagram, you know, those filters, if they become too focused on how they look rather than how they're speaking, then it could actually not be a particularly useful practice. And that, I think, is a little bit of a challenge for us. Daisy?
And I think as well, like, and I know I'm guilty of it. I'm not a teacher or a lecturer, and public speaking is certainly not a forte, but I do, on occasion, I have had the misfortune of watching back recordings of myself. And you realize we all kind of have quirks where you repetitively say the word like, it's literally this, or you say like, and so like this happened and then like that. And you don't notice it when you're doing it, but if you are rehearsing and recording and watching back is when you can understand and see yourself. I always stand with my hands in my pockets, or I look down when I'm speaking to an audience. You know, it's a very good learning curve, I'm sure.
And I tend to use my hands too much. Yeah, every now and then when I see myself, and obviously it's been difficult with Zoom, but before we were all online, I would sort of every now and then see myself again and go, right, remember, calm the hands down. I'm deliberately bringing them up here because I'm so used to it, and because I know that I'm only this visible in the square, but I do tend to over gesticulate. I can be a little bit enthusiastic to the point of distraction, and that's when I know that I have to turn it back. But yeah, Daisy, have you got any observations from your students? Are they willing to watch themselves on video, or in a scholarly context rather than in a Instagram context? I don't know. I'm just curious.
Well, I teach politics and law, so it's certainly not an issue with my students. But I suppose because this particular challenge is dealing with STEM students, you could appeal to the scientist in them to use it as an experiment, I suppose, to look back at themselves, observe, and then, you know, record or jot down ways that they can reflect or improve upon it. So I suppose, yeah, using it as that scientist sort of observation experiment might be something that the kids would get on board doing. But from a teaching standpoint, obviously, my students in politics and law are perfectly fine with recording themselves and reviewing and coming back with feedback.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, my university students, when I proposed the idea, they were like, "Oh no, we don't want to do that." But I was very pleased to say that by the end of the semester, we'd moved on. So in my experience then, and I'm just going to share the screen once more. So in my experience, what I've been able to encourage my students to do when they watch themselves, I usually ask them to consider that they're watching their very best friend do their very, very best try. And I use the words to watch yourself with kindness and detachment. So being detached, focusing only on the presentation and the kinds of things that matter in the presentation and not going, oh, my nose is too big. So being detached and emotionally detached from it so that they can have a little bit of objectivity, but also to have that kindness there and to only focus on identifying each time they review, only come up with a limited number of things to fix. Don't give themselves a massive laundry list of things to fix, but each time only focusing on one or two things. So this paper suggests that in most students who do watch the videos of themselves, they actually end up with a much more balanced idea, but balanced perception of how they spoke. And the interesting sort of meta thing is I gave this as a reading to my science presentation students last year. And I said, look, I was thinking of making the assessment task, that you also do a video of yourself and you submit an appraisal, or that you watch yourself on video. And they're like, oh, no, I couldn't possibly do that. And what would be even worse is watching myself on video with the rest of the class. No way. I don't want to watch a video of myself with everyone else. By week 12, when they were producing videos, they were all showing rushes, drafts of their video in class, giving each other feedback and about editing, shots, etc. Going, oh, you could say a little bit less here and you could do that there. And they didn't even notice it. And unfortunately, I didn't realize until after the class ended to say, you remember how back in week 4, you said you would never watch yourself on video in front of the whole class? You've just done it. And I think it was just their ability to detach. Like they all said, oh, I don't like watching myself, but then focused on the task. So they were able to go, well, hang on a sec, what am I able to approve here? What am I looking for? How long should this shot be? And also I really tried to set up a community and an atmosphere within that class that it was okay not to fail, but okay to not be perfect. I did the table topics with them. I've shown them some of the worst videos that I've ever been in, and made sure that they felt, told them about times where I had also found things challenging. So I really tried to set up an atmosphere of where the most important thing is to try and being really supportive. And I'm fairly lucky that I have a small class, but I would imagine with the students that are doing this in your schools, again, trying to set up that mutual supportive community and supportive learning space is actually really important, because it is quite daunting and students can feel quite vulnerable during presentations. Before I start to go into science communication careers and a little bit more about science communication education in WA, are there any other questions or comments related to that idea of learning to watch with detachment and kindness, and also setting up an environment where students can support each other's learning?
I think that's really fantastic. And 2 words definitely worth remembering is watch yourself with detachment and kindness. A wonderful lesson.
Cool. All right, so just in the concluding part of the workshop today, it's a word from our sponsor time. It's like I've had your undivided attention, and that means those of you watching it on the video may stop now. But I hope you just I wanted to just go through a little bit about some of the options for science communication education, at least here, mainly here at UWA, just again to sort of make you aware that this is something that students can do when they come to university, and also just a little bit about careers, and I guess particularly starting to think about the careers of the future and how important science communication skills are going to be in a range of careers. So where can science communication take you? As I mentioned, for those of you who saw the presentation or have watched the video from last week, I went through my own career and you could see how diverse it was. And I also did a short version today, going from a scientist to working in a science centre, to working with a research organisation, to working for another research organisation, but ultimately working in radio, working in digital content production there, and then moving back into research and teaching. So I've definitely benefited from a wonderful diverse career in science communication. The study options that we have here at UWA is that science communication, we have a number of undergraduate units that students can just take as electives within the other things. So if they're doing chemistry, they might be able to take 1 or 2 units just as electives. If they want to do 4 units, they can do a science communication minor. So we actually have 4 undergraduate units in total. If students do all 4, they can end up with a minor in science communication. So they can do either a single or 2 majors in the sciences, or even a science arts major, and still fit in a minor. We also get students doing the Master of Science Communication, and so often students have finished a bachelor's degree in science and decided that they may not want to go on to be a scientist, but they're still very interested in science communication and developing that further. If they've done the minor, they can skip some units in the Masters. If they haven't done if they have not done any of the undergraduate units, then they do those as conversion units as part of the Masters as well. The Masters course here is a coursework and dissertation, although students can elect to just do coursework only as well. And the dissertation students do an original piece of research in a science communication problem, and we have a very, very good publication rate. Most of our master's students end up with a scholarly paper based on their dissertation. The sort of main units that we do have a level 1 communicating science unit that had 750 students in it this last semester, and that introduces presentations and scientific writing. But then we have specialist units in presentations where I go through oral presentation, then introduce them to podcasting and then to video production as a way for them to build those oral communication skills, but in a few different ways. And because obviously multimedia production is really important these days. We have a unit in science writing. That's where I take students through a range of genres, such as the explainer. We also look at news and media releases, and then they write a feature article for a science magazine. And some of those feature articles are amazing. Some of our students have gone on to become the science editor for the student magazine here as well. The other undergraduate unit is exhibitions and interpretation. And that's really looking at science communication in that museum, science centre, botanic gardens, zoos, aquariums, national parks sector. So that really looks at that sector and how they communicate science and speak to their audiences. So when you look at those 3, apart from the initial level 1 unit, we're basically focusing on science communication through the spoken word, then through the written word, and then through object and place, which really I think covers most of the science communication ways that we have. That includes also events and festivals and things like that. And all of them have a bit of a digital content production component as well. Within the Masters, we also have a unit on citizen science. The undergraduates can't do that, but I wanted to mention it because citizen science is definitely growing and to be one of the main ways that we're a very popular way of engaging the community in science. And there was no tertiary unit anywhere in Australia that was going to equip people to manage these type of projects. Often they're scientists that don't necessarily have any experience in public engagement with science. And some of these projects are huge. So we were the first ones to bring that in. We also have a theory unit, and then there's option units as well as the dissertation, of course. And the kinds of careers that we can have, communications officers, outreach coordinators, science writers, policy officers. Scientists also need communication skills, obviously, and there's many others. That was really just this list that I had quickly come up with, but I'm about to, this Friday, we're about to have the Western Australian branch of the Australian Science Communication Association. There's going to be over 70 people there working in fields from natural resource management. Some of them are in regional hubs looking at science engagement. We have the SciTech team, people working in research centres, academics, students, people working for NGOs, government agencies, etc., are all coming together to share experiences. I will hand over to Wayne very shortly to see whether there are any other reminders, but I just wanted to put up the last slide now so that we can end with our discussion. That slide has my email address on it. Please feel free to send me an email if you wanted to pick up on any of the topics that I've raised in the 2 workshops. I'll be making this slide, this set of PowerPoint presentation available via Wayne as well. And yeah, with that note, I will stop presenting. Did I stop presenting? Have I stopped presenting? Can you see me or the PowerPoint?
I can see you.
Yes, okay. I wasn't too sure whether I had stopped. Does that mean that I wasn't actually presenting just then?
You didn't put up your email address.
Oh, so I stopped there. I was trying to work out where I might have, because something had gone wrong. Let me just share again. Sorry, I could tell that something had gone missing from current slide. So you can see my email address now?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I must have just clicked stop share a little early when I thought about it, and I couldn't work out what had happened there. So yes, my email address is there and my Twitter handle as well. And of course, you can always get in touch with Wayne, and to get in touch with me, that would be fine. I'll stop sharing now. So any questions, comments? Thank you for that feedback, Daisy. That's lovely.
It really was fantastic, Heather. Thank you so much. Listening to you, you might just make a public speaker of me yet one day. I always feel like I've learned so much listening to you. That concludes our 2nd teacher training workshop. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. If you have any questions about FameLab Academy, how to run it, need support, want to go through the student workshops, please feel free to get in touch with me, book a time, and I'll take you through everything. But once again, I have to just say a massive thank you to Dr. Heather Bray and UWA for your inspirational expertise, insights, and resources that have really helped benefit and enrich the schools and teachers that participate in FameLab Academy. I know you've been under the pump with exams and so much else going on, and you've still made so much time for FameLab Academy and given so much of yourself. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. I just hope everyone has a really enjoyable experience with FameLab Academy, and I'm hoping that I can see the finalists down the track. Maybe I can make it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Lovely.
Well, thank you, everyone. And hopefully we will see you all soon.
Yeah. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Heather.
See ya.